Welcome back. Whether you are prepping for a high-stakes strategy meeting or catching up on the latest systemic economic trends, or, maybe you are just intensely curious about the structural realities of where the world is heading, we are thrilled to have you here for another custom-tailored deep dive.
Yeah, it is really good to be back at the table.
We know you want to grasp these complex systemic concepts without that overwhelming info overload. So we are just going to dive straight into the deep end today.
Right. And we are picking up the thread on our serialized solution space analysis of designing futures, authored by Jafar.
Yes, Jafar's framework. It has been fundamentally shifting how we look at institutional design. But before we get into the specifics of today's session, we need to ground ourselves.
With the guiding philosophy of the entire project.
Exactly. For those of you tracking the overarching thesis, here is the baseline. Designing futures is not a solutions manual, it's a narrowing of the field. This series explores which futures remain structurally viable once trade-offs, incentives, and limits are taken seriously.
That framing is just so crucial. It prevents us from falling into the trap of, utopian wish lists. We are evaluating structural realities here, not science fiction.
Which makes our previous deep dive so vital to keep in mind. We explored how, as global coordination costs plummet, artificial intelligence is shifting the broader economy. It is moving us away from permanent, static jobs.
Toward a modular assembly of talent.
Right. Organizations are becoming highly liquid. They are no longer incentivized to pay for continuous clock-in, clock-out labor. Instead, they are sourcing episodic human judgment.
We are rapidly transitioning into a global bidding market. And in that environment, contribution defines value, not just time spent sitting in a chair.
The implications for institutional memory alone are staggering.
Oh, absolutely. But it also forces this brutal reevaluation of what human capital actually means when the execution of tasks is entirely commoditized.
And that structural shift is the perfect entry point for today's focus. We are analyzing episode 8 of Jafar's work. It carries the title, Creativity Requires Engineered Friction.
It is a brilliant concept.
It is. But before we dive into the mechanics of that, let's just do a quick tone check for everyone listening. This is not a moral critique of your digital habits.
No, not at all.
We are not here to scold anyone about screen time or, rail against the modern internet.
That is a really important distinction to make early on. What we are doing is conducting a clinical observation of cognitive architecture.
Yes.
The core paradox Jafar presents is that higher-order creativity, which is rapidly becoming our primary comparative advantage in an AI-integrated economy, well, it requires the exact discomfort and boredom that modern digital interfaces are specifically engineered to eliminate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with how the fundamental definition of economic value is shifting. We know AI has reached a point of mastery regarding rule-based execution.
And pattern detection, structured recall.
Right. Basically, the heuristic Jafar uses is incredibly sharp. If a task can be fully specified, it can be automated.
Yeah, if you can write a comprehensive standard operating procedure for a workflow, an AI system can and will execute it.
Oh.
Faster, cheaper, and with far less variance than a human operator ever could.
So if the entire domain of execution is essentially handed over to silicon, human value has to anchor itself somewhere else.
It shifts to judgment under uncertainty.
Exactly. It moves to cross-domain synthesis. The ability to take a latent concept from, say, evolutionary biology and apply it to a supply chain bottleneck. It is about problem reframing.
And perhaps most importantly, ethical trade-off reasoning.
Right, because an AI can generate 10,000 statistically probable solutions to a logistical challenge.
But it requires an autonomous human intellect to look at the board, assess the broader context, and realize that the organization is actually trying to solve the wrong problem entirely.
And that frames creativity in a completely different light. It strips away the romanticized idea of creativity as just, artistic decoration, like painting a canvas or writing a novel.
Jafar is arguing that creativity is the essential cognitive infrastructure for a human-led economy. It is the absolute bedrock of first-order discovery.
We have to separate the ability to execute from the ability to originate.
Yes. An education system or a corporate training pipeline that fails to deliberately cultivate that internal generative capacity, that ability to originate, is merely producing people who can execute.
And producing pure executors in the AI era is just a recipe for structural
What
obsolescence.
really is?
So let's ground this for the listener by looking at the actual mechanics of how this origination happens. Jafar points toward the experimental science of inward attention and this concept of productive boredom.
Right.
But let's be real for a second. When you say temporary understimulation, my mind immediately goes to standing in line at the DMV or staring at the ceiling in a dentist's waiting room.
Is agonizing.
Yeah. Most of us reach for our phones because that boredom feels terrible, not productive. So how does Jafar differentiate between useless boredom and actual idea incubation?
It is a very fair pushback. The distinction really lies in the duration and the environment. Jafar clearly separates chronic monotony from temporary understimulation.
Okay, break that down.
Chronic monotony is like working a highly repetitive assembly line job for years, or being trapped in a chronically under-resourced environment. That degrades motivation, it suppresses cognitive function, and it just crushes morale.
So the DMV scenario leans toward chronic disengagement if there is no bounded goal.
Precisely. What the cognitive science actually supports is temporary understimulation within a safe, bounded environment. When external stimulation drops precipitously for a fixed period, the brain's attention networks are forced to shift inward. The default mode network, which handles mind-wandering, mental simulation, associative recombination, it becomes highly active.
It is essentially the mind's attempt to reorganize itself when immediate external rewards are entirely absent.
Yes.
If the environment isn't feeding the brain a narrative or a quick dopamine hit, the brain just starts generating its own internal models to fill the void.
Jafar summarizes the mechanism beautifully. He says, creativity is supported by controlled internal turbulence.
Controlled internal turbulence.
Yeah. You need that temporary starvation of external input to trigger the internal generation.
But if we look at the reality of modern attention architecture versus cognitive architecture, we run into a massive systemic mismatch.
A huge one.
Consider a typical student or a junior analyst today. They might spend a few hours engaged in structured reasoning or applied problem solving in a classroom. But then they spend the vast majority of their waking hours in high-frequency, algorithmic stimulation environments.
In keeping our clinical lens intact here, we do have to acknowledge that those algorithmic environments are highly effective at enhancing certain cognitive traits.
Sure, high-frequency gaming or rapid-feed social platforms are fantastic for improving reaction speed.
Rapid pattern recognition, rapid-fire information filtering.
But the conditioning effect is the variable we need to watch. Those environments condition the mind to expect incredibly short novelty cycles.
Yes. They reward immediate gratification and foster a deep, deep dependence on external validation loops.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, higher-order creativity requires the exact opposite cognitive toolkit.
Completely the opposite. To originate a novel concept, you need robust ambiguity tolerance. You need the capacity for delayed gratification.
The stamina for extended internal simulation.
And most critically, you need discomfort endurance.
Because sitting with a blank page or staring at an ambiguous data set with no clear correlation is inherently uncomfortable. It causes psychological friction.
Absolutely.
And if our default behavior is to immediately alleviate any cognitive friction by reaching for a device that provides an instant answer or a distraction, we atrophy the very muscle required for origination.
That is the core structural observation of Episode 8. Attention environments determine cognitive capacity.
Without structural protection for internal divergence, the cognitive gains made during focused study easily erode in the algorithm.
The environment you place your attention in physically shapes the architecture of how you think.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Jafar doesn't just diagnose the problem. He proposes a structural intervention.
Right.
He introduces the concept of cognitive expansion intervals, CEIs. To really grasp this, we should probably start by defining what CEIs are not.
They are definitely not meditation sessions. They are not relaxation blocks or wellness breaks.
And they are absolutely not unstructured idle time where students or employees are just left to stare at a wall.
No. If we define them by action, a cognitive expansion interval is a deliberately engineered block of time where external inputs are completely removed.
A specific ambiguity or constraint is introduced.
And the individual is forced to generate internal models to resolve that exact ambiguity.
The momentum of a CEI relies entirely on the tension between external stimulation and internal generation. You drop the external input to near zero, you introduce a cognitive constraint, and you force the internal generation to spike to bridge the gap.
It frames friction not as an obstacle to learning, but as an institutionalized necessity.
It is engineered boredom designed to establish cognitive sovereignty.
Exactly. And Jafar outlines an operational gradient to show how these CEIs should scale across a student's developmental life cycle.
He recommends about 60 to 90 minutes of embedded in-school time per week for this, right?
Yes. The operationalization is where the theory really proves its worth. So, Phase 1 targets grades 1 through 5 with what he calls imagination windows.
These are short, maybe 10 to 15 minutes daily.
Very short. The prompts are highly constrained but open-ended. So, for example, invent a new physical tool for planting seeds, or redesign a common household object.
And the output is low stakes, a drawing or a verbal story. The objective isn't to draft a patent. The goal is simply to normalize internal ideation.
It builds a baseline comfort with independent thought at an early age, long before the algorithmic conditioning fully takes hold.
But phase 2 is where the gradient steepens significantly. This covers grades 6 through 9 and focuses on constraint-based divergence.
This is a massive focus area. Students are given a practical, multivariable problem and severely limited resources. But the structural key here is absolute isolation from external data during the ideation phase.
No internet access.
No search engines.
They just have to sit in the friction.
Yeah.
If they are asked to design a localized logistics plan for moving supplies across a flooded city, they can't just query an AI for the optimal route. They have to internally model the physics, recombine ideas, and build frustration tolerance.
But Jafar includes a brilliant dynamic regarding artificial intelligence in this specific phase.
Tell me about that.
AI tools are permitted, but exclusively during the critique phase.
Oh, wow. That completely inverts our current default behavior.
It really does. Right now, the temptation is to use the LLM to bypass the friction of origination entirely. A student asks the AI for the core idea and then simply formats or executes the AI's output.
But Jafar's model forces the human to originate the messy, unrefined idea in a state of productive boredom first.
Exactly. Then, they take their internally generated logistics plan and feed it to the AI.
But the AI doesn't solve the problem.
No. It acts as a rigorous Socratic adversary. It stress tests the student's assumptions, points out structural flaws in their routing, and demands stronger reasoning.
That is a brilliant pairing of human origination and machine execution. You supply the generative spark, the machine supplies the analytical wind to see if the spark holds.
Yes. The primary focus for these middle-grade cohorts becomes frustration tolerance and the ability to defend and iterate an original concept.
And that sets the foundation perfectly for Phase 3, aimed at grades 10 through 12, destabilization labs.
This is where the training wheels come completely off.
Students engage with highly ambiguous cases and conflicting data sets. Imagine giving a 10th grade class a data set from an environmental watchdog group about a local water crisis.
And then a completely conflicting data set from the Regional Agricultural Board.
In that scenario, there is no correct answer hidden in a textbook. The students have to map the system variables themselves.
They have to identify exactly where the uncertainty lies. They generate competing frameworks to manage the water supply, and then defend one of those frameworks under structured adversarial critique.
Creativity matures here. It graduates from coming up with a neat idea to engaging in systemic reasoning under instability.
Which perfectly mirrors the judgment under uncertainty that we established earlier as the core human advantage in the liquid economy.
The entire gradient leverages established cognitive science. Building automaticity and foundational skills frees up working memory, while these intervals of forced incubation improve cross-domain problem solving.
It is the principle of desirable difficulty. CEIs aren't about removing academic structure at all. They are about layering structured destabilization on top of foundational fluency.
So what does this all mean when we try to pull this out of a textbook and drop it into a real-world public school system?
This is a challenge.
Because mandating deliberate friction and destabilization sounds like an implementation minefield.
The implementation risks are substantial, and Jafar does not shy away from the pitfalls. If a school administration treats this as just another compliance metric, you end up with performative forced creativity.
Which yields zero cognitive benefit.
None. And we have to consider the psychological impact on highly conditioned students.
Right. Think about a high-achieving 11th grader today. They are likely optimized for high-certainty rubrics. They know the exact formula to achieve an A on a standardized test.
If you suddenly plunge them into a destabilization lab with conflicting data and zero internet access,
You aren't going to foster creativity. You are going to trigger severe academic anxiety.
which is exactly why Jafar emphasizes that psychological safety norms and process-focused rubrics are non-negotiable safeguards.
You cannot evaluate a cognitive expansion interval based on the objective brilliance of the final idea.
The rubric must evaluate the student's reasoning clarity, their resilience in the face of the constraint, and their engagement with the process of internal divergence.
Because chaos without psychological safety breaks cognition. But chaos within a structured, safe boundary strengthens it.
Precisely.
But beyond the classroom implementation, there is a much broader socioeconomic risk here.
This raises an important question about the equity dimension. We really have to analyze this through the lens of cognitive equity.
Let's follow the diverging paths. What happens if this research is only adopted by high-resource environments?
It's a systemic warning.
Imagine a scenario where wealthy families or elite private institutions are the only ones who structurally protect this internal exploration time. They ban devices during specific hours, they enforce quiet incubation, and they deliberately engineer healthy friction.
Meanwhile, lower resource public environments, stretched completely thin on budgets, default to keeping students continuously occupied with high-frequency digital saturation just to maintain order.
The outcome of that divergence is stark.
If the ability to originate is the primary driver of value in an AI-integrated economy and only high-resource cohorts are trained in origination,
Then creative capacity becomes a highly stratified asset. The cognitive infrastructure required for economic mobility literally becomes a luxury good.
if you can't originate, you can't participate in the global bidding market we talked about earlier.
You are relegated to executing tasks that haven't yet been automated, effectively guaranteeing structural underemployment.
It means cognitive expansion intervals cannot merely be a lifestyle recommendation for proactive parents.
They must be institutionalized.
Jafar argues they are a fundamental right, a form of cognitive equity required for baseline survival in our coming economic reality.
Because AI will unequivocally master structured execution. The human advantage rests entirely on reframing problems, navigating ethical uncertainty, and sustaining independent internal thought.
And that level of thought does not emerge from a state of constant stimulation. It doesn't emerge from cognitive comfort.
It is forged when the mind is forced to reorganize itself under an engineered constraint. Education reform cannot simply be about cramming more STEM subjects into a crowded curriculum. We have to fundamentally redesign the attention environments our institutions foster.
We are ultimately talking about the preservation of cognitive sovereignty. It is about maintaining the ability to own your internal mental models in a world heavily incentivized to outsource that modeling to a server farm.
We have dissected some incredibly dense structural theory today. For you listening, whether you are managing a liquid team, designing a curriculum, or just trying to navigate your own attention span, the core lesson to distill from Jafar's work is this.
Creativity is a muscle.
Exactly. It is a biological, cognitive muscle, and like any muscle, it requires resistance to grow. It only strengthens when it is deliberately denied the crutch of immediate information.
The friction is the feature. You have to endure the gap in stimulation to build the capacity to generate.
Which brings us to a final thought we want you to mull over. We've talked extensively about embedding engineered friction into schools and personal routines. But consider the trajectory of the technology itself.
Where is it heading?
What happens when artificial intelligence becomes capable of perfectly simulating engineered friction for us? If an AI acts as a flawless, personalized, Socratic adversary, doling out just enough frustration to keep us engaged without letting us quit, are we still exercising genuine cognitive sovereignty?
Or are we just outsourcing the curation of our own boredom to the algorithm?
Exactly. If our environments never allow our minds to feel a gap, how will we ever develop the strength to bridge one?
That is the frontier of human-computer interaction, and it is a dilemma we are going to face sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. And it is the perfect bridge to where we are heading next. In our upcoming session, we are launching a mini-series on AI governance frameworks.
But we are moving way past surface-level content filters and bureaucratic red tape.
We are going to explore what governance looks like when it is deeply engraved and ingrained directly into the DNA of the AI architecture itself. It is a fascinating pivot from cognitive architecture to machine architecture.
Stay tuned.
Stay curious.
Stay systemic.